They expected death but got chocolate. The Truth About American Soldiers in Germany, 1945. The Forbidden Love That Changed History, American GIs and German Women. Why German Mothers Wept When American Soldiers Gave Food to Their Starving Children. The Shocking Moment Nazi Propaganda Shattered What Really Happened When Americans Arrived. From Enemies to Family, the 15,000 German war brides who married American soldiers. The one thing German women never expected from their American conquerors. Hitler's Last Lie, how German women discovered the truth about American soldiers. The chocolate bar that ended a war, American kindness in defeated Germany. Forbidden by command, driven by compassion, the soldiers who broke orders to save German children. What happened when 20,000 German women married the enemy and moved to America? German women were shocked by the generous and caring American soldiers. Then on the morning of March 7, 1945, a young German woman named Martha Becker stood at the shattered window of her family's farmhouse outside the village of Oppenheim, watching an olive green column of American tanks rumble down the cobblestone road. Her hands trembled not from the cold spring air that whistled through the broken glass, but from a terror that had been planted deep in her mind by 5 years of relentless propaganda. And through the tank's steel treads scraped against ancient stones, creating a sound like the tearing of fabric. And Martha pulled her 2 young children closer to her worn cotton skirt, whispering prayers she no longer believed would be answered.
With surgical precision,
in her arms, 3-year-old Emil clutched a wooden toy soldier his father had carved before disappearing into the frozen hell of the Eastern Front 2 winters
in
earlier.
hushed conversations
6-year-old
and bread
Greta
lines and
pressed
air
her
raid
face into her
shelters,
mother's
women
hip,
traded
trying to
whispered
block out
stories
the
of
mechanical
atrocities that
thunder that
awaited them.
announced the arrival of their
Martha had
conquerors.
absorbed these
What
warnings
Martha
into
could
the
not
marrow
know
of her
in that
bones,
moment of
had
paralyzed
felt them
fear
calcify
was that
into
the next
certainty
hours would
during the
shatter
long
everything
nights
she
of
had been
Allied
taught
bombing
to believe
raids
about
when
the
earth
enemy.
shook and the sky turned orange. Now, as the first American soldiers dismounted from their vehicles in the village square below, she prepared herself for the nightmare she had been promised. But what emerged from those tanks and jeeps was something Martha's mind struggled to process. The soldiers who assembled in the square were not the haggard, vengeful demons of Goebbels' imagination. They moved with a casual confidence that bordered on carelessness, their uniforms clean and intact, their faces neither twisted with hatred nor gaunt with deprivation. While German soldiers returning from the front had looked like walking skeletons wrapped in tattered field gray, these Americans appeared impossibly well fed, their cheeks ruddy with health, their gear abundant and new. They chewed gum, a luxury Martha had not seen in years, and some laughed as they worked, as if war were merely an inconvenience rather than an apocalypse. The contrast was so stark that it created a cognitive dissonance in Martha's mind, a crack in the edifice of everything she thought she knew about this conflict. To understand the depth of shock that German women like Martha experienced in the spring of 1945, one must first comprehend the systematic construction of their expectations. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had not simply lied to its people, it had created an alternate reality so totalizing that truth itself became unrecognizable. From 1933 onward, Goebbels had understood that the most effective propaganda was not the obvious lie, but the artfully constructed narrative that wove truth and fiction into an inseparable tapestry. The ministry controlled every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every film, every theater production, ensuring that the German people lived inside a carefully curated information bubble. During the war's final years, as military defeats mounted and the noose tightened around the Third Reich, this propaganda grew increasingly apocalyptic in tone. The Allies were portrayed not merely as enemies, but as existential threats to the German people's very survival. Soviet forces were depicted as Asiatic hordes intent on exterminating the German race, while American and British forces were characterized as puppets of international Jewish conspiracies seeking revenge for Hitler's persecution of European Jews. The message was clear and consistent. Defeat meant annihilation. German civilians, and particularly German women, were told they would face mass rape, murder, and enslavement. This was not merely scare tactics. It was a deliberate strategy to ensure that the German population would fight to the last breath rather than surrender. The propaganda found fertile ground in a population traumatized by years of total war. By 1945, most German families had lost fathers, sons, or brothers to the fighting. Cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left millions homeless. Food shortages had become critical, with daily rations falling to starvation levels in many areas. In Berlin and other major cities, women received just 11 ounces of bread, 14 ounces of potatoes, 1 ounce of grain, 2/3 of an ounce of meat, and 1/4 ounce of fat per day, a total of approximately 1,200 calories. This was less than half the minimum necessary for basic survival and a mere fraction of the 3,000 calories that British civilians were receiving at the same time. Children were starving. Infant mortality rates were approaching 65% in many locations. In this context of complete physical and emotional exhaustion, the terrifying narratives about American brutality seemed entirely plausible. Moreover, German women had reason to believe that the propaganda might contain truth. They knew, even if they did not speak of it openly, that German forces had committed unspeakable atrocities across occupied Europe. The whispers about concentration camps, about mass shootings, about deliberate starvation of occupied populations had filtered back despite official censorship. If Germany had done such things to others, the logic went, why would others not do the same to Germany? The principle of proportional retribution was deeply embedded in human psychology, and in the moral accounting of total war, German women feared they would be presented with a terrible bill. This fear was not entirely unfounded. The Red Army's advance through eastern Germany had indeed been accompanied by widespread sexual violence and brutality, validating the darkest predictions and amplifying terror in areas not yet occupied. In this atmosphere of dread, Martha Becker and millions of women like her watched the American advance with a mixture of relief that the Soviets had not reached them first and terror about what was to come. They had been taught that Americans, though perhaps less barbaric than the Soviets, would still exact a heavy price. The propaganda had specifically warned about African American soldiers, playing on racist stereotypes to magnify fears about rape and violence. German women had been instructed to hide, to resist, to choose death over dishonor. Some had prepared poison for themselves and their children rather than face capture. Others had armed themselves with whatever implements they could find: kitchen knives, farming tools, broken glass. When the Americans arrived in their villages and towns, these women were not simply frightened. They were convinced they were facing the end of their world. The moment when propaganda collides with reality is always jarring. But for the German women who first encountered American soldiers in the spring of 1945, the cognitive dissonance was profound enough to be physically disorienting. Martha Becker's experience in Oppenheim was replicated in hundreds of villages and towns across Western Germany as American forces pushed through the final defenses of the Reich. In each location, a similar pattern emerged: initial terror giving way to confusion, confusion giving way to cautious hope, and hope giving way to something that felt dangerously like relief. The Americans who entered these German communities were, for the most part, young men far from home who had been fighting for months or years across Europe. They had witnessed the horrors of war, had lost friends to German bullets and shells, and had liberated concentration camps that revealed the full depths of Nazi depravity. Many carried deep anger toward Germany and Germans. The non-fraternization policy that had been imposed on them reflected this anger. They had been explicitly ordered to avoid all social contact with German civilians, to refuse gifts, to maintain strict emotional distance, and to view every German as a potential enemy. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's letter to his troops had been unambiguous. They were to keep clear of Germans, man, woman, and child, unless meeting them in the line of duty. They were not to walk with them, shake hands with them, visit their homes, make them gifts, or accept gifts from them. In short, they were not to fraternize at all. But policies written in distant headquarters could not account for the human reality on the ground.
When American soldiers entered German villages and found not defiant Nazis, but exhausted, terrified civilians, especially children with hollow cheeks and vacant eyes, many found the non-fraternization policy impossible to maintain. The Americans had been raised in a culture that valorized compassion and fair play, that distinguished between soldiers and civilians, that saw protecting children as a fundamental moral obligation. They had been fighting, they believed, to liberate Europe from tyranny, not to punish women and children for the sins of the Nazi leadership. When confronted with the visible suffering of German civilians, particularly children, thousands of soldiers made the decision to disobey orders and offer help. The first gifts were small and offered furtively, in violation of explicit regulations. A chocolate bar pressed into a child's hand when no officers were watching. A can of rations left accidentally on a doorstep. A blanket draped over the shoulders of a shivering woman. These acts of kindness were technically violations of military discipline punishable by court-martial, and soldiers caught fraternizing did face disciplinary action in the early weeks of the occupation. But the soldiers kept doing it anyway, driven by an impulse that ran deeper than regulations. They saw children who looked like their younger siblings, mothers who reminded them of women back home, families destroyed by a war they had not chosen. The cognitive dissonance between the orders they had received and the human reality before them created a moral crisis that most resolved in favor of compassion. The impact on German civilians was seismic. When Martha Becker's children received chocolate from American soldiers for the first time, they did not immediately understand what they were holding. The brown bars wrapped in olive green paper were objects from another world, a world of abundance that had become mythical in wartime Germany. Emil, Martha's 3-year-old son, sniffed at the chocolate tentatively, uncertain if it was even edible. Greta, his older sister, remembered chocolate from before the war, but could barely believe it was real. When they tasted it, the sweetness was so intense, after years of near starvation, that both children began to cry. Not from fear or sadness, but from an emotion so complex that Martha could not name it. It was not just the chocolate itself, but what the chocolate represented. The possibility that they might survive, that the future might hold something other than suffering, that the men in olive green uniforms might be something other than the monsters they had been taught to fear. For Martha herself, watching American soldiers distribute food to her starving children created an internal crisis that would take months to fully process. Everything she had been told, everything she had believed, was revealed in that moment to be a lie. The Americans were not rapists or murderers or demons. They were young men, some barely older than boys, who shared their rations with hungry children, despite having no obligation to do so. They smiled and laughed and seemed uncomfortable with the gratitude that German civilians tried to express. They called German children buddy and kiddo and taught them to say thank you in English. Some showed photographs of their own families back in America, bridging the gulf of language and nationality through the universal language of parenthood. This was not what vengeance looked like. This was not what defeat was supposed to feel like. This was something that Martha's vocabulary could not accommodate, something that required her to rebuild her understanding of the world from first principles. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled through German society in ways both immediate and profound. In the short term, it created intense confusion and disorientation. German women had been psychologically prepared for one scenario and confronted with its opposite. The resulting cognitive dissonance manifested as a kind of emotional paralysis. Women who had expected to die found themselves alive and being offered help by the very people who were supposed to be killing them. In the longer term, this experience became a foundational element in the reconstruction of German identity and the eventual alliance between Germany and the United States. The chocolate and kindness of 1945 became, in collective German memory, the moment when the possibility of redemption emerged from the ashes of total defeat. The non-fraternization policy was doomed from its inception, though it took American military leadership months to acknowledge this reality. The policy had been crafted in the abstract by men in Washington and London who viewed the occupation of Germany as primarily a punitive exercise designed to drive home the lesson of defeat. It reflected a desire to maintain strict discipline among occupation forces, to prevent the development of relationships that might compromise military effectiveness, and to ensure that Germans understood they had lost the war and would be held accountable for Nazi crimes. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it was unenforceable from day one. The primary problem was that the policy required American soldiers to view all Germans as interchangeable representatives of Nazi evil, but the reality on the ground made such dehumanization psychologically impossible for most American personnel. When soldiers interacted daily with German civilians, employing them as clerks and translators, requisitioning their homes for billets, hiring them for reconstruction work, they inevitably began to see them as individuals rather than as abstract enemies. They met women who wept while describing lost husbands and sons. They encountered elderly men who denounced Hitler and claimed to have never supported the Nazis. They found children suffering from malnutrition and disease through no fault of their own. The distinction between Nazi perpetrators and ordinary German civilians became harder to maintain when faced with the humanity of specific individuals. Moreover, many American soldiers actively rejected the premise of collective guilt that underlay the non-fraternization policy. They had been raised with American ideals of individual responsibility and fair play, and while they despised Nazism and were horrified by the concentration camps they liberated, many struggled to blame women and children for the crimes of the German state. Private letters from soldiers during this period reveal this internal conflict repeatedly. They wrote of their anger at what Germans had done, but also of their discomfort with treating all Germans as war criminals. Some explicitly compared the situation to hypothetical occupation of America, asking whether it would be fair to blame American women and children for decisions made by American leaders. This moral reasoning, right or wrong, made many soldiers psychologically incapable of maintaining the emotional distance the policy required. The practical demands of occupation further undermined the policy. American forces needed German cooperation to maintain order, to restart basic services, to identify and apprehend Nazi officials, and to begin the massive task of reconstruction. This required constant interaction with German civilians, making the prohibition on fraternization absurd in practice. Officers found themselves in the position of having to work closely with German officials while simultaneously maintaining that they must avoid all social contact with Germans. The contradictions became farcical. Could an American officer share a meal with a German mayor to discuss reconstruction priorities? Could a soldier accept a glass of water from a German family on a hot day? Could a military policeman help a lost German child find her mother? The answers to these questions were never clear, and in the absence of clarity, soldiers made their own judgments. Perhaps most significantly, the policy clashed with the biological and emotional realities of young men stationed far from home in the company of young women. Despite years of propaganda demonizing Germans, many American soldiers found German women attractive, and vice versa. The exhaustion and desperation of German women made them particularly vulnerable to American attention, but it would be overly simplistic to characterize all such interactions as purely exploitative. Many genuine romantic attachments formed between American soldiers and German women during this period, attachments that would eventually lead to thousands of marriages and fundamentally reshape both American and German societies. The sexual dimension of fraternization was the aspect that most concerned military authorities, both because of fears about venereal disease and because of concerns about soldiers being compromised by German women who might be working for underground Nazi organizations. But despite severe penalties, including confinement and dishonorable discharge for some offenses, soldiers continued to pursue relationships with German women. The military leadership's response to this widespread disobedience evolved slowly and reluctantly. General Dwight Eisenhower initially attempted to enforce the policy strictly, authorizing punishment for violators and issuing regular reminders about the importance of maintaining discipline. But by June of 1945, even Eisenhower recognized that the policy was creating more problems than it solved. On June 11, 1945, he issued an order lifting the ban on fraternization with German children, acknowledging the obvious reality that soldiers were already interacting with children, and that preventing such interactions was neither practical nor morally defensible. The following month, in July 1945, the policy was further relaxed to permit soldiers to engage in conversation with adult Germans in public places. Finally, in September 1945, Field Marshal Montgomery effectively abandoned the policy in the British zone, simply reminding his soldiers to conduct themselves with dignity and use common sense. The American zone followed suit in October 1945, though some restrictions remained in place, particularly regarding marriage. The collapse of the non-fraternization policy had profound implications for the occupation and for German-American relations. It signaled that the purely punitive phase of the occupation was giving way to a more constructive approach focused on rebuilding Germany as a stable, democratic ally. It allowed relationships between American soldiers and German civilians to develop openly rather than clandestinely, which paradoxically gave military authorities more rather than less control over such interactions. And it created the conditions for the mass phenomenon of war brides, German women marrying American soldiers and immigrating to the United States in unprecedented numbers. This human migration would become one of the most significant and lasting legacies of the occupation period, fundamentally changing both American and German societies in ways that continue to resonate today. The journey from that first tentative chocolate bar pressed into a child's hand to the development of romantic relationships between American soldiers and German women was neither simple nor uniform. These relationships evolved through distinct phases, each with its own dynamics, challenges, and controversies. Understanding this evolution requires examining both the structural conditions that made such relationships possible and the individual human choices that transformed initial contacts into lasting bonds. The initial phase, lasting roughly from March through August 1945, was characterized by tentative, often clandestine interactions conducted in violation of official policy. During this period, most contact between American soldiers and German women occurred in the context of humanitarian assistance or practical necessity. Soldiers distributed food, medicine, and supplies to desperate civilian populations. They requisitioned German homes for billets and employed German women as housekeepers and interpreters. They hired German workers for reconstruction projects and interacted with German officials in the administration of occupied territories. These interactions were supposed to be strictly businesslike and emotionally distant, but human nature rarely cooperates with such sterile directives. For German women, these initial encounters were fraught with complex and often contradictory emotions. The relief of discovering that American soldiers were not the vengeful demons of propaganda was immense, but it coexisted uneasily with shame, anger, and grief. These women had lost husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons in a war that Germany had initiated and lost. Their country lay in ruins, their cities bombed into rubble, their economy collapsed, their political system utterly discredited. They faced an uncertain future in which basic survival was the primary concern. In this context, American soldiers represented not just immediate material assistance, but also the possibility of a different future, one that might include enough food, physical safety, and perhaps even happiness. The psychological dynamics of these early interactions were complicated by massive power imbalances. American soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped members of the victorious army. German women were hungry, desperate members of the defeated population. This asymmetry meant that even seemingly benign interactions were shadowed by the potential for exploitation. Some German women did engage in transactional relationships, sex in exchange for food, protection, or material goods, out of economic necessity rather than genuine affection. The occupation created what was essentially a market for female sexuality, with cigarettes, chocolate, and canned food serving as currency. This reality troubled military authorities, German community leaders, and many of the participants themselves. It also generated considerable hostility toward women who associated with American soldiers, who were sometimes labeled as traitors or prostitutes by their fellow Germans. Yet to reduce all German-American relationships to exploitation or prostitution would be to deny the genuine human connections that did develop. Many soldiers were themselves quite young, 18, 19, 20 years old, and far from home for the first time in their lives. They were lonely, traumatized by combat, uncertain about their futures and hungry for connection with women who spoke their language of vulnerability even when separated by the barrier of different native tongues. German women of similar ages were also lonely, traumatized, and uncertain, having lost fiancés and boyfriends to the war and facing bleak matrimonial prospects in a country where millions of young men had been killed or maimed. When these young people met, often in circumstances of extraordinary emotional intensity, genuine romantic attachments formed despite the enormous cultural, linguistic, and circumstantial barriers separating them. The second phase of German-American romantic relationships began in earnest after the formal relaxation of the non-fraternization policy in the summer and fall of 1945. With official sanctions lifted or reduced, soldiers and German women could interact more openly. The black market, which had been a shadowy underground operation during the strictest enforcement of anti-fraternization rules, became semi-institutionalized, with American soldiers trading military supplies for various goods and services. Some military units even began organizing social events, dances, parties, film screenings, to which German women were invited. These events were controversial and sometimes met with protests from both American and German communities, but they provided a socially acceptable venue for interaction. The autumn and winter of 1945 through 1946 was a period of intense social mixing. American soldiers and German women filled the cafes and beer halls of occupied cities, walked together through rubble-strewn parks, and attended concerts and theater performances as couples. The contrast between American abundance and German deprivation remained stark. One November 1945, survey found that 56% of American soldiers had been talking with German girls during the previous 7 days, with 25% spending 10 hours or more in such conversations. For many German women, particularly those in cities, association with American soldiers became a pathway to accessing not just material goods, but also elements of normalcy that had been absent during years of total war. Movies, music, dancing, flirtation. These small pleasures acquired enormous significance for people who had lived under the shadow of death and destruction for so long. The issue of marriage between American soldiers and German women became one of the most contentious aspects of the occupation. Initially, such marriages were absolutely forbidden by military regulations, reflecting both the punitive spirit of the immediate post-war period and practical concerns about soldiers making impulsive decisions they would later regret. The ban on marriage was maintained even after other aspects of the non-fraternization policy had been relaxed, creating a situation where soldiers and German women could date openly but could not formalize their relationships. This restriction generated enormous frustration among soldiers who had fallen genuinely in love and wished to bring their German girlfriends home to America. The pressure to lift the marriage ban came from multiple sources. Soldiers themselves lobbied strenuously for the right to marry, arguing that they had fought for freedom and should not be denied the freedom to choose their own wives. Military chaplains who counseled hundreds of couples in the months after the war's end became unexpected advocates for lifting the ban. These chaplains, initially opposed to German-American relationships on moral and practical grounds, changed their positions after witnessing the sincerity of the couples who came to them seeking help. Chaplain Major Thomas Anderson wrote in an official report, "These are not war trophies or conquests. I have married these men before combat and buried them after. They deserve the right to choose their own wives." Such testimonials from respected military personnel help shift official opinion. The ban on marriages to German women was finally lifted on December 11, 1946, though with significant restrictions and bureaucratic hurdles designed to discourage all but the most committed couples. German women seeking to marry American soldiers faced an extensive and often humiliating investigation process. They underwent political background checks examining any Nazi connections, however tenuous. They submitted to multiple medical examinations to screen for venereal disease and other health conditions. They provided character references from German community leaders. They endured interviews with military intelligence officers who questioned them about their motivations, often with the explicit assumption that they were marrying for economic gain rather than genuine affection. The entire process required a minimum of 3 months and often took considerably longer. Margaretta Thompson, who married Sergeant James Thompson in 1947, later described the ordeal of the application process. They asked if I was a Nazi, if my parents were Nazis, if I had dated German soldiers, if I was marrying for money, if I was pregnant. They examined my entire life like I was a criminal. Jimmy was furious, but I told him it was worth it to be together. This intrusive scrutiny was deeply offensive to many women who had already endured years of deprivation and trauma, but thousands submitted to it anyway because marriage to an American soldier represented their best chance for a stable future. The investigation process also reflected genuine concerns about fraud, infiltration by Nazi sympathizers, and the potential for American soldiers to be exploited by opportunistic women. Whether these concerns were proportionate to the threat is debatable, but they shaped the experience of every German woman who sought to become an American military bride. The response to the lifting of the marriage ban was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours of the announcement, military offices received 2,500 marriage applications. By January 1947, that number had risen to 7,000. Each application required 15 different documents, 3 medical examinations, and interviews with military intelligence, creating a massive bureaucratic undertaking for the Occupation Administration. The processing of these applications revealed the scale of German-American romantic involvement. Tens of thousands of soldiers had formed relationships serious enough that they wished to marry and bring their partners to the United States. The War Brides Act of 1945, signed into law by President Harry Truman on December 28, 1945, provided the legal framework for this mass migration. The act exempted foreign spouses and minor children of American servicemen from normal immigration quotas and restrictions, allowing them to enter the United States as non-quota immigrants. While the act was initially focused on British war brides, it was subsequently extended to cover spouses from other countries, including Germany. Between 1945 and 1948, when the act expired, approximately 115,000 women, 333 men, and 4,669 children entered the United States under its provisions. Estimates suggest that between 14,000 and 20,000 of these war brides were German. The journey to America was itself an ordeal for many German war brides. They traveled by ship, often spending weeks in crowded conditions on converted troop transports. They left behind everything familiar, language, culture, family, homeland, to join men they often knew only briefly, and to enter a country they had never seen. Many spoke little or no English. Many had never traveled outside their home regions before the war. Many faced hostility from American families and communities who resented their German origins and questioned their motives for marrying American soldiers. The challenges of cultural adaptation, language acquisition, and social integration were formidable, yet the vast majority of German war brides successfully built lives in America. They learned English, raised children, worked jobs, and became American citizens. They maintained connections to German culture and language while embracing their new identities as Americans. They served as living bridges between two countries that had been bitter enemies and were becoming critical allies in the emerging Cold War. Their children, the so-called GI babies, grew up with dual cultural heritages that enriched both American and German societies. In retrospect, the war brides phenomenon represented one of the most significant and successful examples of cultural exchange and integration in American history, though it was rarely recognized as such at the time. Not all children born of German-American relationships during the occupation period became American citizens. A substantial number, estimates range from 68,000 to 96,000, were born to German mothers and American fathers who did not marry or who abandoned their families when they returned to the United States. These children, often called GI babies, faced particular challenges growing up in post-war Germany. They carried the visible markers of their American paternity, sometimes through racial characteristics in the case of African American fathers, and always through the stigma of illegitimacy in a deeply conservative society. The situation of biracial children born to German mothers and African American soldiers was especially difficult. German society in the 1940s and 50s was deeply racist, a legacy of Nazi racial ideology that persisted long after the regime's collapse. These brown babies, as they were often called, faced discrimination in schools, employment, and social relationships. Many struggled with identity issues, belonging fully to neither German nor American culture. Some were placed in orphanages or foster care when their mothers could not cope with the social ostracism of raising biracial children. Others were adopted by American families through organized programs, most notably one coordinated by Mabel Grammer, wife of a U.S. officer stationed in Mannheim, who facilitated the adoption of approximately 500 Afro-German children by African-American families in the United States. The stories of these GI babies, whether biracial or not, illuminate the personal costs of occupation and the complexity of German-American relations during this period. Daniel Cardwell, born in Marburg in 1950 to a Polish-German mother and an unknown American father, spent 30 years and $200,000 searching for information about his origins. He discovered that his mother, 20-year-old Hedwiga, had left him in a children's home and later emigrated to the United States, possibly searching for his father or for Daniel himself. She never found either, and in 1982 she was found dead in her bedroom in what was ruled a suicide. Such tragic stories were not uncommon among GI babies, many of whom grew up with fundamental questions about their identities that they could never fully answer. For children who remained in Germany with their mothers, life could be extremely difficult. They often grew up in poverty as single mothers struggled to support families without male breadwinners in a society that provided minimal social services. They faced bullying and social exclusion from peers and adults who viewed them as embodiments of Germany's defeat and humiliation. They sometimes struggled to establish legal identities and citizenship rights. Yet many also found ways to thrive, using their unique backgrounds to become bridges between cultures and advocates for international understanding. The experiences of GI babies remained largely unacknowledged in both German and American societies for decades, emerging into public consciousness only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as the children themselves became adults with voices to tell their stories. The relationships between American soldiers and German women did not occur in a vacuum, but rather formed one thread in the complex tapestry of post-war reconstruction and the emerging Cold War. Understanding these relationships requires situating them within the broader context of American occupation policy and the transformation of Germany from defeated enemy to critical ally. The initial American approach to occupation had been punitive, reflected in planning documents like the infamous Morgenthau Plan, which proposed deindustrializing Germany and reducing it to an agrarian economy. This approach reflected understandable anger about German aggression and Nazi crimes, but it quickly proved both impractical and counterproductive. The reality of conditions in occupied Germany, millions of displaced persons, widespread food shortages, collapsed infrastructure, and political chaos, demanded a more constructive approach focused on stabilization and reconstruction rather than punishment. By 1946, American policy had shifted substantially toward what would eventually become the Marshall Plan, massive economic assistance designed to rebuild Germany as a stable, prosperous, democratic state. This shift was driven partly by humanitarian concerns about German suffering, but also, and perhaps primarily, by emerging geopolitical calculations as tensions between the United States and Soviet Union escalated into the Cold War. A strong West Germany became essential to American strategy for containing Soviet expansion in Europe. The personal relationships between American soldiers and German civilians, from the chocolate given to starving children to the marriages between GIs and German women, became both symbol and substance of this transformation from enmity to alliance. The humanitarian assistance provided by American forces during the immediate post-war period, while sometimes delivered in violation of official policy, played a crucial role in this transformation. When American soldiers shared their rations with hungry German children, they were engaging in what we would now call public diplomacy, though most did so without any such strategic intention.
When military units organized flood relief efforts or provided medical assistance to German civilians, they were building the foundation for a positive relationship between former enemies. When soldiers and German women fell in love and married, they were creating permanent human connections that would endure long after the occupation ended. The contrast between American behavior in occupied Germany and Soviet behavior in the eastern zones became a powerful element of Cold War propaganda and genuinely influenced German public opinion, while Soviet forces engaged in widespread rape, plunder, and brutal repression in their occupation zone. American forces, despite some instances of misconduct, generally behaved with discipline and relative restraint. The difference was stark enough that millions of Germans fled westward to escape Soviet occupation and seek refuge in American, British, or French zones. The food, medicine, and other assistance provided by American forces, combined with the personal relationships that developed between Americans and Germans, created a foundation of goodwill that proved essential to the eventual success of West German democracy. The story of German women shocked by the generosity and caring of American soldiers is more than a heartwarming tale from history. It represents a fundamental moment in the transformation of German-American relations and the broader architecture of the post-war order. The chocolate bars, canned rations, and acts of kindness that passed from American soldiers to German civilians in 1945 became symbols of a different possibility, that former enemies could become friends, that war could give way to peace, that humanity could transcend nationalism. For Germans who experienced the American occupation firsthand, particularly those who were children during that period, the memory of American soldiers' kindness remained vivid decades later. Joachim Zinram, interviewed by his daughter in 2020 about his experiences as a child in post-war Germany, recalled, "When we were not in school, sometimes all we had was a slice of bread for a whole day. When we were lucky, we found some mustard and put it on the bread, just to have something different." He remembered American soldiers stopping their vehicles to give candy, chocolate, and bubble gum to children. "We were in awe. These were like treasures to us." Though he noted with a smile that the candy tasted better back then, he emphasized that the Americans did not see us as their enemies anymore. The U.S. government helped us rebuild our country. This sentiment, gratitude for American assistance and a sense that Americans had chosen Reconstruction over revenge, became a foundational element of West German identity and the transatlantic alliance. The war brides and their children became living embodiments of this German-American connection. They maintained ties to both countries, transmitted cultural knowledge across the Atlantic, and reminded both Germans and Americans that their nations were bound by more than strategic interests. They were bound by families, by love, by children who carried both heritages in their blood. The success of German war brides in integrating into American society, despite considerable initial prejudice and numerous practical obstacles, demonstrated that even the bitterest enmities could be overcome through human connection. The narrative of American soldiers' kindness to German civilians also served important purposes in the mythology of both nations during the Cold War. For Americans, it reinforced the self-image of the United States as a fundamentally benevolent power that used its strength not for conquest, but for liberation and reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and other acts of American generosity toward former enemies became central to American Cold War identity, distinguishing American power from Soviet oppression. For West Germans, the memory of American kindness in 1945 helped facilitate the rapid transformation of Germans from Nazi perpetrators to democratic allies, allowing for a focus on the future rather than dwelling on the shameful past. Yet the reality was always more complicated than the mythology suggested. The American occupation was not uniformly benevolent. There were instances of violence, sexual assault, and exploitation. The food shortages that caused widespread German suffering in 1945 and 1946 were partly the result of Allied policy choices about resource allocation. Many German women who associated with American soldiers did so out of economic desperation rather than genuine affection. The children born of these relationships often faced difficult lives marked by poverty, stigma, and identity confusion. The chocolate and kindness were real, but so was the suffering, the complexity, and the moral ambiguity inherent in any occupation of a defeated enemy. What remains remarkable, however, is that despite all the complications and contradictions, genuine transformation did occur. The German women who expected death and received chocolate, who anticipated rape and experienced respect, who feared for their children's futures and saw those children grow up in peace and prosperity. These women witnessed and participated in one of history's more hopeful turning points. The propaganda that had shaped their expectations proved false not because it was defeated in argument, but because it was contradicted by lived experience. The soldiers who offered chocolate and kindness, whether acting from orders or from conscience, became agents of reconciliation who helped transform enemies into allies. Martha Becker, watching American tanks roll into Oppenheim on March 7, 1945, could not have imagined that 7 years later she would be living in Ohio, married to a former American soldier, raising her children as Americans while teaching them about their German heritage. She could not have predicted that the terror she felt in that moment would give way to gratitude, that the propaganda she had believed would be revealed as lies, that the enemy would become family. But history often moves in unexpected directions, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it moves toward reconciliation rather than revenge, toward connection rather than division, toward the sharing of chocolate rather than the infliction of suffering. This story is ultimately a story about the power of individual human choices to transcend historical enmity and political propaganda. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of conflict, the possibility of connection remains, that even the deepest hatreds can be overcome, that even the most comprehensive propaganda can be defeated by simple acts of kindness. In a world that remains divided by nationalism, ideology, and fear, this remains a lesson worth remembering.